right. So welcome, Christopher, to the show. Thank you so much for being here in your mountain house. I'm so jealous.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to think about this before you came on to record, and I think you're the first pastor, minister person I've
Oh
ever
wow.
had on the podcast.
I'm honored. I'm honored. That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
That's a badge of honor for me.
Yeah. I think, religion is such a perhaps controversial is the word I want to use topic.
Mm,
One that's definitely a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but that's also kind of the point that I really enjoy about having a podcast like this is, having some of these uncomfortable conversations.
sure.
But I'm wondering if you could start off just sharing a little bit of like how you got into doing the work that you do today. If you were kind of raised very religious within the community, if you kind of got into it, if you could maybe share a little bit of that background.
Yeah, I grew up in the Bible Belt, which is the funniest phrase to me ever. Because if the South is the Bible Belt, America has its pants down. Because it's just it's not a very
Mhm.
wholesome place at times. But I grew up in the Bible Belt, and I came from the Baptist and Pentecostal traditions, and slowly after studying Scripture through the course of my career became much more progressive and
Mm.
eventually found my way out to more of a blue state. So I live in Santa Cruz, California now
Mhm.
and have some work that I'm doing out here.
Okay, yeah. And you're an agnostic
I am.
minister.
I am.
I mean, we got to get into that. I'm all about holding opposites and challenging shit. What does that mean to be an agnostic minister to you?
So I am a Christian ethically, but spiritually, I tell people I'm not sure because I'm not really credentialed enough to speak with any amount of certainty whether there is or is not something above this like tangible physical experience. But for me personally, I've seen no scientific evidence of anything spiritual, but I do find powerful moral teachings in the scripture that I align with, specifically in the Gospels and the social justice oriented message of the Gospels, which is why I align as a Christian ethically, but spiritually, I would say I'm agnostic, almost atheistic at times.
And when you say spiritually, you say that you don't see any scientific proof of, this sense of spirituality. How? What about nature?
So I think it depends on how you define spirit, right? So when I
Yeah.
said that formally, it's more about how like we in Western society define spirituality, which is
Hmm.
this. We kind of have a a dualistic approach to spirituality in life. Like you have your spiritual life and you have your physical life, which is not how ancients define their life. They just, if you were alive, you were spiritual because the same word for spirit in the Bible, in both the Koine Greek, which is the New Testament, and the ancient Hebrew in the Old Testament, the same word for spirit in both texts is breath. So for them, life is spiritual. Life is
Hmm.
amazing. There's awe and wonder in nature and in everything that surrounds
Hmm.
you. So if we're talking about the ancient definition of spirituality, then yes, I'm very spiritual. But if we're talking about this Hellenistic ideal that kind of merged with spirituality, centuries later, because of
Hmm.
Roman culture getting their hands on the Christian tradition, then no, I would not be very spiritual. So I guess it depends on how you define spirituality.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I'm like thinking from my perspective, I'm like, yeah, well, how I think of spirituality, I'm like, there is scientific proof of that.
Hmm.
But in the maybe more traditional Anglo-Saxon white American of Christianity, that's not what
Yep.
spirituality is about.
No, no,
Yeah.
not at all. And I would say in that realm, I am not very spiritual.
Hmm.
But if I look at the wonders in the universe and just the complexities of everything that's unknown in the vast void, which is space, and how
Hmm.
the chance for life is so, rare in the
Hmm.
universe and throughout the cosmos, I would say that yes, there's something to be inspired by, and there's definitely
Hmm.
something spiritual from an ancient definition there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, so this month is Masturbation May. which really is like it.
It gets a month?
I know.
See, they
I
don't
know.
cover this stuff in seminary. I didn't know that at all. That's wild. That's
Yeah.
wild.
It's
Jeez.
amazing. A whole month to celebrate masturbation, which can be celebrated all year long.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to have this conversation around, and this is something that you've talked about purity culture and
Mm.
the impact that that can have with sexuality, with LGBTQ communities, within the religious community.
Mm.
Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. I think the concept in our modern age of purity culture stems from this really high value in a biblical marriage that really never was. When people are taught about biblical marriage from pulpits, there's typically this very Americanized view of marriage being projected from the pulpits. But if I'm being honest, biblical marriage and biblical sexual ethics is something that I hope is never resurrected. This is an archaic practice. It is centuries and centuries old. It stems from a very misogynistic way of life. And throughout the text, not only is it problematic, but it's not consistent. If you start in the Old Testament, the story of the ancient Judaic people, which is fascinating and has so much rich wisdom, I believe, for us. But when it comes to marriage, I would say that any civilization at that time should not have their practices resurrected. And it started out in the Bible with folks that were polygamous. And the value of virginity was only placed heavily on women because they were considered to be property. If you actually look in the text, nowhere in the Bible, because there are extremely misogynistic views portrayed in the Bible, does it ever say that men should abstain from sex. It's specifically women. And again, that's unjust. It should not be resurrected.
Especially when we the ones popping you out.
Yeah. I mean, it's, unfortunately, we haven't dealt with this centuries and centuries later. It's like, Christianity and the scriptures in which it emerged from are extremely misogynistic. In 2,000 years, not a fucking thing's changed. And it drives me nuts. But what's interesting is it did change in the scriptures because it started out as polygamy. And then by the time we get to a text called Songs of Solomon, which is really just a dude's sexual escapades with hundreds of women. Like, it's 50 Shades of Yahweh. It's not like, I don't even know why it made it in the Bible, to be honest. It's wild. And by that point in history, we had like this patriarchal polyamory going on where men were allowed to have multiple partners and concubines. Women were not. They were still viewed as property at that time. Again, horrible ethics. And then when we get to the New Testament, something interesting happened. There's a shift from polygamy and polyamory to monogamy that takes place. And some of the best scholars have concluded that this actually does not have roots in Judaic history because they were all about polyamory and polygamy and having multiple partners specifically for men. But with monogamy, where we can see a root in that mindset is in Roman traditions and in Hellenistic societies. So Jesus was not a Christian. Christianity did not come about until hundreds of years after Jesus died. Jesus was a Jewish man. And by the time Rome got its hands and infused imperial values and nationalistic ideals into the text, they took their value of monogamous marriage and inserted it into the text, which is why there's such a contradiction between both testaments. So we've got a problem with marriage right off the bat. So if you're trying to portray this ideal of a biblical marriage from the pulpit, it's not really there. And if we're trying to nail down a specific sexual ethic throughout the scriptures, it's not there either. So what I think the church should do is shut the bedroom door. We've been talking about this way too long. And if sex is occurring between two consenting adults and it's respectful and it's about giving pleasure to each other so they can enjoy this life experience, more power to them, because the Bible, in my opinion, has far more to say about the condition people are sleeping in than who people are sleeping with.
That's a mic drop right there. Yeah.
It's on a stand. I can't.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like even as I'm like hearing you, there's a lot of shit that you just said that is so new for me, and that I'm like, I have no idea because like that's not my area. I've never gone into that at all. But it
Mm,
all makes sense as you say it, and kind of just reinforces this like intense frustration that I have felt around how we essentially use in our culture religion as a weapon to stigmatize sex, and create all of this. I honestly, trauma is the word I want to use,
sure.
around how we engage with our bodies,
Mm,
how we interact with other bodies when it comes to pleasure and sexuality. And
yeah.
I'm very, very not far in reading this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, all about like indigenous wisdom and knowledge. And just in the first few sections, you learn about the Sky Woman, and she kind of compares it to Sky Woman versus like Adam and Eve, this story
Mm,
of like the creation, and this notion that like Eve was she was essentially punished for engaging in pleasure, and Sky Woman is
mm.
all about flourishing is mutual, right? And we're gonna, she comes down, she like has the nuts and seeds in her hands, and she spreads them around, and like the people and the animals come together. It's such a beautiful story.
That's awesome.
It's so beautiful. I'm like, oh, that's such a different like thing than like take and you're punished and you're exiled, and pleasure is not like something you should engage in. And again, Adam and Eve, I'm sure there's things to it that I don't know. But just from my own like mainstream cultural understanding of it, it does create this sense of like, don't engage in pleasure. It's bad for you. You have to earn it, especially as a woman, especially if you have a vulva or a vagina.
Hmm.
And that, as you were saying, that the Bible has a lot of misogynistic ideals and kind of concepts within it, that really just create shame around our bodies
Absolutely.
and create like a what I want to say is like an intense power differential that reinforces patriarchy, which hurts all of us.
Sure. It absolutely does. And I think one thing that you've done is you've exhibited a healthy, what we would call like exegesis of holistic teachings of creation poems, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the problem, I think, where it begins with a lot of Christians is they open things up and they see Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning God created, and they're like, okay, cool, God created this in the beginning, he did it in 6 days, and they use masculine pronouns for God, and they kind of take the English version as literal truth.
Mm-hmm.
I take the Bible far too seriously to read any of it literally. And most of the reason that I do that is because one of the first things you learn in seminary is that Genesis is a poem. It's a metaphor. Until much later in church history, it was never read as literal metaphor. In fact, Jewish peoples, they share this text that they would never, most of them would never tell you to read it as a literal story, but Christians do, because again, toxic theology made its way into the church. And there's so many things in that first chapter of Genesis that people either read as metaphor or don't know because they don't read in the original language. Like, for example, God is portrayed as very masculine in the Bible. In the first chapter of the Bible, he is seen throughout that text. The ancient Hebrew word for God in Genesis is Elohim, and it's neither male nor female. It's actually meant to be not only gender neutral, but gender fluid. God is trans and masculine and feminine. God is all of us. That's what's meant to be portrayed in that term. So the first word we have for God is not masculine, which so many Christians don't know this, and it blows my mind. And then they, go on from there and they take this story as it's like a history book. And that's a giant mistake. Like there's so many people that are reasonable people that align with Christian ethics that shut the doors to the church because they've refuse to consider the possibility that evolution didn't happen, and they're not going to church for all the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's a metaphor. Just because it's not literally true doesn't mean that there isn't powerful truth in the text. You can find truth in any story,
Yeah.
but taking the Bible as scientific fact, there's where a lot of the problems start, because when you start looking at this binary situation where God made Adam and Eve and only Adam and Eve. That's where a lot of their toxic theology starts.
Yeah.
And they start saying God only made these two to be together. And then they use that and they start oppressing LGBT people. And, it just goes on from there.
Ugh.
It's nasty, nasty stuff. And it's why I stay in the church, because I feel like if we can redirect this narrative to talk about truths that they teach in seminary, and not just in progressive seminaries, but in conservative seminaries, they teach you this stuff. But pastors refuse to talk about it because they don't want to lose their congregants. One, because they feel like they don't want to stir the pot too much. Sometimes they don't want to lose their job, which I guess I can sympathize with because people have bills to pay. And, I don't think pastors at these Six Flags Over Jesus churches need to be driving Corvettes, but at the same time, if they work, they need to be paid, and they're worried about their families in tough economic times. I get that. Or they don't want to let go of this superstitious theology that they learned in Sunday school when they were 6 years old. It's almost like they're clinging to Santa and the Easter Bunny. And for me, those are just really bad reasons not to talk about this, because there's so many people that are feeling shame about their sexual identity or their gender identity or pleasuring their body, which is a natural thing to do in this human experience. I mean, hell, I'm going to be honest, I do it. So there is nothing sinfully wrong with it. And yet that is something that is all too common in the church. So that's why I stay in it, to kind of keep, pushing the boundaries of what Christianity became versus what it was intended to be.
And now, may the revolution of Jesus go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you in healing this wasteland and protect you through the storm. May it lead you through this world seeking the justice it demands for you and for others. And may it bring you home preparing to continue love's mission beyond your doors. Grace and justice to you.